Today on the Lazy RPG Talk Show, we're going to look at the Iskandar Adventures Volume 1 Kickstarter by MT Black. I'm going to do a spotlight on the Torrents of the Spellhoarder Giant Adventure by Elderbrain. We're going to look at Rob Heinsoo's interview on Mastering Dungeons, an article on Scroll for Initiative about Pass Without Trace, Bob Worldbuilder's excellent video on abstract combat maps. We're going to talk about the undervalued tool of abstract maps, this really, really excellent idea and why it's such a big deal. And we're going to cover more questions from the May 2024 Patreon Q&A, all today on the Lazy RPG Talk Show. I'm Mike Shea, your pal from Sly Flourish, here to talk about all things in tabletop role-playing games. This show is brought to you by the patrons of Sly Flourish. Patrons of Sly Flourish get access to a whole bunch of tools and adventures to help them run their 5e games, tips for running their 5e games. They get access to the awesome Lazy GM community over on Discord, and they help me put on shows like this. To the patrons of Sly Flourish, thank you so much for your outstanding support. MT Black has been making tons of really awesome RPG products, including his Iskandar City Handbook, which I think is a really, really cool city source book in not a lot of pages, in a small, affordable product. Really, really cool product. And he is putting out a new Kickstarter for the Iskandar Adventures Volume 1. This is a series of adventures set in his campaign setting of Iskandar, 5 different adventures, 30 hours of challenging gameplay, he says, featuring epic combat, engaging role-playing, and fascinating exploration. 140 pages, digest-sized pages, and it is all for a very reasonable price, as is all of his stuff. The digital book is $10, and that includes the Iskandar Player's Handbook. The interesting thing about the Iskandar Player's Handbook, he built this shortly after the 5.1 SRD went into the Creative Commons, which meant he took the entire 5.1 SRD, but then tailored around his world of Iskandar and made it a very affordable product. And you can actually get that as part of your print, part of your PDF copy for a total of $10. I backed it. I'm very excited about it. I love MT Black's adventures. I love the products that he puts out. Very, very, MT Black, Raging Swan, Arcane Library, they're all putting out these very focused, straightforward, independently published RPG products for 5th edition, for different versions of RPGs, but 5th edition. And I really like them. They're very, very cool. And it's a very affordable price. I like that MT Black keeps his price tag low, so your drive to get in, your ability to get in there is very easy. Shameful, however, that he has no one-click sample. But I can tell you, one of the reasons why you want to have a one-click sample to show a product is to know that the publisher can make the kind of product that they are putting out. We already know that is the case with MT Black. He has put out dozens and dozens of adventures and his source books and everything else. I've seen them. I've had them in hand. I have no doubt that he will be able to produce what he's been able to produce at the same quality level as the other products he has. So I forgive him for not having a single click downloadable sample chapter, but I always like to have a single downloadable sample chapter. He could even take one of the adventures and make them available and say, hey, here's a freebie adventure that shows the kind of style. But hey, here we are. Lots of different add-ons. You can get a hardcover version. I for this kind of product, I tend to find that I like to get the PDF of it. I like to have the PDF on hand. I think if I knew I was going to run them, if I knew that I was going to have them, I would definitely want to get a physical book. So yeah, it's going to be fulfilled through drive-through RPG from print on demand. That is good to know because we know that how their publishing works. And it looks like your product, that $20 is including the cost to print the product and everything else. Sometimes you'll have a lower price print product, but you have to pay the price of printing and shipping. In this case, you're just paying the price of shipping. So that is pretty good. But yeah, MT Black has, already written and edited the book, has 50 credits of other books that he's done. You can, in fact, if you don't have his other books, this idea of a premium digital bundle, like there's a premium bundle, it looks like $60, gives you all of the PDFs of all of the stuff that he's done before, and the Iskandar Adventures physical book. So that's a pretty good deal. If you're not familiar with MT Black's products and you want to get the whole package, this is the whole package. And that's a very affordable price for all the stuff that you get. But it is also nice that you can just pick up the digital book alone with the Iskandar Adventures and the Player's Handbook together in a PDF for $10. Very, very cool. I like it a lot. I love his work, and I'm very happy to see it. I was not given any kind of special compensation for this. I backed it myself. Speaking of Kickstarters, Torrents of the Spellhoarder by Elderbrain was a Kickstarter that happened sometime in the past. I don't know. I can't remember, last year, something like that. And I backed it and I thought, oh, this would be kind of cool. And I really like the work that Elderbrain has done before. They did the adventure Crown of the Oathbreaker, which I think is the largest physical RPG book I have. It's like 1,000 pages long. It's like a 1 to 10 adventure, but just piled with stuff. I've done spotlights on it in the past. You can take a look at it. But they also put out this other adventure called Torrents of the Spellhoarder. I backed it. I got it. They did send me, so I backed the PDF version. However, the company did send me a beautiful physical version of the book as well. So I was given a review copy of this book. So it is a very big book. This is a 500-page adventure, seafaring-based adventure, lots of dragons, necrotic necromancer krakens, lots of different sort of intrigue going on, plots of different groups that have gotten involved in kinds of all sorts of evil stuff, a big Sahuagin plot. One thing that's interesting, so this is a very select, very specific product. I didn't realize it when I had done I may have mentioned it and then forgot and then got the adventure, and I sat down with it yesterday in my little chair over in the corner over there and started reading through it and read the summary of kind of what is going on. It is a very high-level adventure. It's a 500-page adventure book that starts at 16th level and goes to 20th level. So it is designed for very high level play, built around this seafaring adventure. I found that rather surprising. It surprised me. I can't remember if I took note of that when I was doing the spotlight on the original Kickstarter, but I certainly took note of it now. It is a gorgeous book. Both the physical volume and the PDF are beautiful. The artwork is amazing. The design is really, really cool. It's a very good looking book. I was not able to spend a lot of time to dive into the plot itself and see, like, are there any major sort of plot issues that would drive me away from it? But I can tell you that you're probably in a small set of people. If you were looking for a 16th level adventure to run for your group and you're like, I want a 16th level seafaring adventure where you're fighting lots of Sahuagin and underwater krakens and stuff. One thing that I would consider, and I didn't really dig into this to find out if they had a way of handling it. So they may have, and I just don't know. I don't know how you keep 16th level characters on a boat. By the time you hit 16th level, nearly everybody can fly, they can teleport, they can plane shift, they can go to lots of different places. At 17th level, one level into this adventure, you already have 9th level spells, like the highest spell levels you can get. And you can do all kinds of zany stuff. Druids with like wind walk and wizards with like 5 different ways to get you around. So I wonder how you keep a sea-based seafaring adventure going when the characters have access to power that is like that high. So again, I didn't dive in to the adventures itself to say, like, how do they manage to handle this kind of thing? So there could be that there's some way. I don't know how you do it and not also remove a bunch of agency from super high level characters as well. I just don't know how you necessarily keep them on a boat. So I think like I said, there's a very narrow particular kind of person who's going to want a product like this, and it is somebody who wants a very high level adventure that is also based in sort of a seafaring campaign with tons and tons of detail and tons of information that you can get. For the amount of material you get, the price is pretty good. Like, you can get the PDF of Torrents for $20 for a 500-page full-color PDF. There is a sampler, so if you want to see the adventure module sample, you can get that for free. I highly recommend again, if you're interested in this at all, there's no reason not to go get the free version and take a look at it and see what you think. And you can get the hardcover for $65. And for a 500-page hardcover with PDF, including like map packs and including some other things that you can get a whole bunch of stuff for that. And then they have lots of other sort of tchotchkes and doodads, booster cards, DM screens, dice, all that kind of thing. So really, beautiful book, really, really gorgeous. I don't know what this is like. And I feel, they made what they made. So who am I to say anything? I could see this being a first to 10th level adventure again, and I bet you might see more use. So who knows? And you have a lot more chance of keeping people on a boat when they don't have access to windwalk and plane shift and a bunch of other ways to sort of zip around the world. You really, and I'm not saying that the adventure doesn't have a way to handle it. I didn't dive in enough to say whether it does or it doesn't. But boy, that's really hard. It's like you got to run a different kind of adventure when you're running for characters that are tier 4. If you like the looks of it, go check out the sample chapter. If you like what you see in the sample chapter, definitely take a look at the Torrents of the Spellhoarder, massive high-level seafaring adventure available from Elderbrain. And Elderbrain, thank you very much for the preview copy of this book. Rob Heinsoo has been doing sort of a circuit. If by circuit we mean 2 different podcasts. I talked about his interview that he did on La Taberna de Rol before, which I found really, really interesting. Equally interesting was his interview with Teos Abadia over on Mastering Dungeons. Really excellent view into the game. Really good in-depth talk with Rob about what's been going on, what goes on in the industry, how things have changed. I definitely recommend it. It was a really, really good interview. Teos did a fantastic job talking to them about it. Talked about what happened, like one of the questions he had, and he kind of wish he had dove in a little more because Rob was there during the 4th edition days of D&D. Like what happened with the OGL, right? Like, that switch from the OGL to the GSL kind of gives us a view into what Wizards had done with the OGL more recently, but also just to hear about the style of game that he has. Rob, one thing I picked up from both of the interviews with him on La Taberna de Rol and on here was the opinionated version of the kind of game he wants to make, that the way he talks, quite frankly, about the fact that he didn't like 2nd edition D&D. And as we know, 5th edition D&D was tied very much to 2nd edition D&D. So it's pretty clear how he feels about 5th edition D&D. He talks specifically he's like, I don't know how anybody has fun with the monsters that are in the 5th edition. Well, I love 5th edition and I love the monsters. I also love 13th Age, and I know where he's coming from on that though. So he talks about how 13th Age monsters and 13th Age monsters in the revision 2 of 13th Age, which is still available on the Kickstarter, how those change. But it's a really, really good interview. I highly recommend it. If you're interested in 13th Age, if you want to hear from an industry insider who is a fantastic designer, right? He brought this up on La Taberna de Rol, which I thought was hysterical, where people said, how do you make it? Kind of the question of how do you make it in this industry? And he's like, well, I cheated. I worked for Wizards of the Coast for a number of years. I was at Wizards of the Coast. I think he was one of the people that was at Wizards of the Coast kind of before they picked up D&D, or he worked in a different branch when they had D&D and kind of made his way over. And he's like, nobody else can do that. There's 5 people in the world that can do what we do, right? And so it's for you asking me advice isn't really fair because I'm one of the 5 people who managed to be a lead designer of one of the versions of D&D. So that's kind of a fun take. Really, really good interview. I highly recommend it. And I'm very much looking forward to the next version of 13th Age. I love 13th Age. Scroll for Initiative had a really fun blog article about Pass Without Trace. This one particular spell that I really enjoyed. And I like this kind of article. I like the article of diving into one particular spell or one particular thing that can kind of cause different problems or get people's attention. And he has an article, they have an article called 12 Reasons to Stop Worrying About Pass Without Trace. Kind of a little bit of a clickbaity article there. And some of them are, some of these reasons, are kind of neither here nor there. But then some of them I thought had a really good point. So the fact that it's pretty hard to come by. It is until it isn't. It's a 2nd level spell slot. Yeah, but that's not so hard to come by. It only lasts an hour. Okay, you can't concentrate on anything else. Sure. You have to stay near your companion. Sure. It isn't invisibility. So part 6 is where I think we get pretty interested. So Pass Without Trace. What makes Pass Without Trace interesting is that Pass Without Trace often gets misconstrued as being a group invisibility. So the spell is a 2nd level spell that lasts 1 hour. It's castable by a bunch of different classes, druids, rangers, some clerics, and they have access to this. A veil of shadows and silence radiates from you, masking you and your companions from detection. For the duration, each creature you choose within 30 feet of you, including you, has a +10 bonus to dexterity stealth checks and can't be tracked except by magical means. A creature that receives this bonus leaves behind no tracks or other traces in its passage. So that seems really good. And +10 to dexterity, +10 to a stealth check is crazy good. That's double advantage, right? It's really, really high bonus. Most of the time, if you have this spell in place, most monsters are not going to be able to see you if you're going by. But in order to understand that this spell, a 2nd level spell, is not 1 hour long group invisibility, but is instead a sort of a limited way to help you with travel, we have to kind of understand how the stealth rules work. And that's where this gets into the idea that it's not invisibility. It doesn't make you invisible. And all of the basic rules for stealth and hiding still come into play. And the big one there is you can't hide from a creature that can clearly see you. So if you're in a room and there's a goblin at a door, you're not going to be able to pass without trace your way past the goblin and through the door, because the goblin can still see. You're not invisible, right? If you're hiding behind a stalactite, or stalagmite, they might not see you. But the minute you step out from underneath or around that stalagmite, they're going to see you. One of the ways that I handle Pass Without Trace, and I just sort of make this kind of a general house rule with each of the groups, is that when they start to talk about Pass Without Trace, I say Pass Without Trace works really well when you're traveling overland. It doesn't work well at all in dungeons. And then I get a bunch of but what if we do X? Or what if the underground? And I just say, it's just not going to work out for you well underground because people are keeping an eye out. It's too tight quarters. You're going to be in someone's view at some point and they're going to see you. Overland, sure, right? Overland travel, there's, if you're outside of 30, 40, 50 feet away from somebody, there's usually something to hide behind. And unless they're really on top of you and really looking for you, it's going to work really well in overland. But what I often set this spell as is this is a good way to travel overland without being detected, without being tracked, but it's not really going to help you in a dungeon. It's not going to help you in small, close quarters. So I think that's an important thing to say, right? And I think it's important that we say that up front before characters start to use it all the time. Then there's some other things. The party doesn't pass or fail as a group. That's true. It's not a group check, so you can still have everybody make their individual checks, but still plus 10. A lot of times they're going to make it. This is one that I hadn't really thought of. It's incompatible with light sources. You can't hold a torch and also be hiding, right? And not if your torch is the one that's illuminating the room. So this is a good one of hey, you're in a dungeon. You cannot count on dark vision. And I have a nice link to my article on dark vision isn't as good as you think, which is an article I've had. It's been quite popular. That, if you are also in darkness, you're at -5 on your passive perception and you have disadvantage of perception checks if you don't have light, even if you have dark vision. So you're going to want to light something up, and if you light something up, then Pass Without Trace isn't going to help you. It's not silence, and it says, yes, it makes a trace with veil of shadows and silence that radiates from you, but that doesn't, and affects creatures you choose. But other things can still make noise. So it won't, for example, stop a thunder wave, right? It doesn't stop, doesn't bypass magic, it doesn't bypass traps, and doesn't really help with blind sight, right? Because it's by sight and hearing. So I think this is a really fun article that kind of gets into why Pass Without Trace in particular isn't as good as you think it is. I think that's useful because I've definitely had groups where they think that Pass Without Trace is a group invisibility, that they should be able to get anywhere they want to get without anybody seeing them. And that's not really true. And if you think about it, a single second level spell should not be that particular. There are a lot of spells like this though. There are a lot of different spells that, kind of how they're interpreted. Charm Person is a big one. What exactly does Charm Person do or not do is a good example. I still go back to Leomund's Tiny Hut. Tiny Hut is a problematic spell for me where, I worry about players using it like a World War II pillbox instead of just a place to rest. And they think no matter where I am in a dungeon, I can drop this in there and I'll be totally fine. And it's sure, but whites are going to attack you the minute you come out. Or some jackass is going to fill the entire chamber with crawling claws so that the minute you drop your tiny hut, you're covered in crawling claws, right? So I often try to say tiny hut is a good way to ensure that you're not going to be bothered when you're in a relatively safe place. But if you do it in a dangerous place, you're just going to get hosed. So there's lots of spells like that where we have to kind of understand what their interaction is with the game, because otherwise they are kind of misused in a way to sort of, break the chance for risk in a lot of situations where frankly, we don't want to break the chance for risk. So really fascinating article from Scroll for Initiative, and I recommend it. Bob Worldbuilder had a really, really good video this past week about grid versus gridless play. And he brought up, he was so nice because he's Sly Flourish in Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master had a poll on this. And he's but then he totally shamed me by saying, oh, but it's so old. Mike is so old and his books are so old that they're irrelevant. I'm not saying he didn't really say that, but he did say yeah, but we haven't had any good data on this in a while. So I went and got some good data, which we're going to dive into in a minute after I talk about his article or after I talk about his video. But his video is really, really good. And he came to the conclusion that I have come to as well, which is there is something in between grid and gridless, which is the abstract map. He doesn't like the term abstract map, and I understand why, because he says they're all abstract, and that's totally true. A 5-foot gridded map is also abstract. One of my favorite arguments, I love to make this one. Many times I get people who say 5th edition D&D is intended to be played on a grid. And as he describes in this video, that is not true. But one way I can prove it is Fireball and Cone of Cold do not sit on a grid. You have to come up with some other crazy way to figure out how a Fireball or a Cone of Cold is going to play out on a grid. You could do it 4th edition style, where you just make them square instead of making them weird shapes. You can get those crazy like bent coat hangers that are all jaggedy so they sit in a pixel. But anytime anybody says that obviously 5th edition is meant to be played on a grid, I immediately say, a Fireball doesn't fit on a grid. Like, how does that work? It's circular. It says radius right there in the spell. There's no such thing as a 20-foot radius on a grid. It doesn't fit. So you have to come up with some kind of abstraction. And that's his point, is like, you're always abstracting something. Like, the minute no matter what level of detail you go to, at some level, it is an abstraction. I'm still sticking with abstract map. I get you, Bob, and you're totally right. But I'm still going to go with abstract map because I need a label. And what are you going to do? It's sort of like theater of the mind doesn't necessarily mean what we think it is, and it doesn't say the exact same thing, but everybody understands it. I used to call it narrative combat. Nobody got that. The SEO for narrative combat is so useless that nobody read my article forever until I said narrative theater of the mind combat, and then suddenly people started to find it. So sometimes we have to pick a term. I'm going to pick abstract map because I think that works better. The idea that it doesn't have a fixed scale, right? That the scale of the map is unfixed. So really, really good video that talks about it. We're going to talk about that a lot more on today's show. But the inspiration for this comes from this video that Bob did about gridded versus gridless play, which is really, really excellent, and I highly recommend. But because I was shamed about being an old man with my old man polls, he didn't really say I'm an old man. He just said my poll is old, but I'm taking it that way for dramatic purposes. I said, fine, then, Bob, I'll run another poll and we'll see. And it was very interesting. The results from this were very interesting. So I want to start off with like the old ones. Way back in 2016, November 2016, we had some results on how many people played in different combat styles. A 63% answered 5-foot gridded combat, 19% said abstract maps, and 18% answered theater of the mind. You could roughly say it's 20-20, that 1 in 5 played with an abstract map, 1 in 5 played with theater of the mind, and 3 out of 5 played on a 5-foot gridded map. That was back in 2016. I hadn't done a poll about that in some time. So I redid it on YouTube recently. Now, of course, the audience has changed. That one was done through Google. The original poll was done as a Google survey that was sent to a lot of different places. So 6,600 respondents was a lot of respondents back in 2016. Remember, D&D in 2016 had like 1/5 of the number of people playing it overall. So it is true. Like 8 years later, a lot of things have changed. And what's interesting is the results. And really what it came down to is now you have 78% of people said they play on a 5-foot grid, 8% on an abstract map, and 14% play on theater of the mind. So a big shift, basically a 20% shift of more people playing on a 5-foot gridded map. We all know that you don't want to build hypothesizing. You don't want to hypothesize after the results are known. You don't come up with a story about your data after you already got the results of the data. Instead, you can come up with a new hypothesis and test that. But I'm going to do it right now. I would expect, I don't think this is true, but I would expect that the reason that we saw a big jump like this in the 5-foot square gridded map is that we now have many more people playing in online tools today than we did back in 2016. I didn't even know if Roll20, Roll20 was around, but it was very, very young. And people playing online, most of the tools that are available to help people play online use a 5-foot gridded map. Foundry, Fantasy Grounds, Roll20, the Maps tool from D&D, Owlbear Rodeo, so even heavyweight to lightweight systems, all of them have some kind of grid. There's only a couple of VTTs that I've seen. Alchemy, I think, is a VTT that focuses on sort of narrative play rather than a grid, but pretty much everything else, Shard, they're all using gridded maps at some point. So if you're using that, they're probably using a gridded map, which I think doesn't surprise me necessarily that it's this high. But only about 1 out of 10 are using an abstract map in order to do in order to run combat. And theater of the mind is down to 15%. Now, it was 20% before, so like that's actually not a big drop. Most of that drop seems to have come from like the abstract, from using an abstract map, and some of it came from running theater of the mind. What this tells me however. So that's true. Like the data are where they are. And again, survey selection bias and everything else, right? Yes. It's just people who happen to be watching my videos or anything like that. And there were even people who said, hey, I didn't even know you ran that poll. It's like, sure, I did get 2,800 responses though. So I feel like it is a good number of people to answer the question that were able to be surveyed and decided to answer the survey. It is not representative of the entire RPG community or the D&D community or anything like that. So, it's still a narrow view. But I also have been promoting Theater of the Mind and abstract maps pretty heavily for years, including having other videos where I talk about it. And still, we have more people. It still has swung the other direction. So this might even be high. I could argue there's probably more people playing Ungridded Play, and that there are more people who don't even know what the hell an abstract map is or how to run Theater of the Mind. So I think that is still, it actually could end up, it could end up being high. But I thought that was pretty interesting. It does bring me to the main topic I wanted to talk about today, which is how the lost art of using an abstract map. Bob Worldbuilder talked about this in his video. He shows really good examples of how you can do this. I want to talk about some of the advantages of having this one particular tool in your toolbox, this idea of running with an abstract map. So I want to define what an abstract map is, just so we're all on the same page. For me, an abstract map is any kind of visual representation of your combat space that isn't using a defined scale. So it's not a 5-foot grid. And you can say like, hey, this is here and this is here, but you're not measuring out specific distances between locations or between participants. Instead, the distances are kind of fuzzy. And you can use some of these fuzzy distances that we see in other role-playing games like zones from Fate or distance, narrative distances like in 13th Age or in Shadow Dark of having something that is close or near or far. My favorite distance of all time is the Shadow Dark double near. I love the idea that you had to come up with a double near. But basically, it's an abstract distance. It doesn't say it's exactly 30 feet or 35 feet or 25 feet. Instead, it's near, right? Close means you're right next to them. Near means you're within, roughly 30 feet, but it could be somewhere. And far away means you can see them, but they're far away. Double near means you're like, I'm getting a double near. So the abstract maps are basically any kind of visual representation that you're using where you don't have a fixed scale. That's what I'm referring to as an abstract map. I have an article that I wrote a few years ago about running D&D combat with an abstract battle map. You can find a link to that in the show notes. And I talk about it in Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master. I talk about it in the Lazy DM's Companion. It is definitely a style of play that I think is undervalued. And I think that my response to the poll that I ran is it is undervalued. That this is a really good, fun, flexible, fast-paced, very affordable way to run combat that is underused, that I don't think a lot of people use because they feel like it has to be on a grid. And I'm going to talk about that, more often. We have this false dichotomy of the idea of a grid or narrative theater of the mind. And you'll hear people say, I hate theater of the mind because I can't see anything. I'm distracted from the game. I can't understand what's happening. There are some people that have a condition like aphantasia where they cannot visualize what's going on without something. And so they lean immediately to, well, that means we need a 5-foot gridded map with miniatures and tokens and everything else. And the answer is no, you can do something in between. You can do this idea of an abstract map. A good example of an abstract map is the old original Final Fantasy kind of battles, where you had all of the heroes on one side of the map and the monsters on the other side of the map, and one of the heroes would jump forward and sweep with a sword a couple times and then jump back and so on and so forth, and damage would go back and forth. That to me was like a really good abstract map. Another example is from the game Darkest Dungeon, where you have like some villains on the right-hand side, some heroes on the left-hand side, and you could sort of like attack across this one-dimensional battle space. That's another example of an abstract map. But often an abstract map can be, you take out a piece of paper, you take out a marker, and you draw a football-style diagram of X's and O's and little bits of details about what the environment looks like so that players can look at that and get a general understanding of the way it works. My favorite tool for this is the Pathfinder Flip Mat. I've been using them for like 20 years now. I have one in my kit that I carry around with me. I have one that's been basically permanently attached to my dining room table that I use forever. And I love that map because it's very open, it's very flexible. You can draw on it with a dry erase marker. You can draw on it with a wet erase marker. And you can make very quick diagrams of what a location is like without worrying. And it is gridded. So your instinct is to build around the grid, but you don't have to. Or you could say, well, these grids are actually 10 feet instead of 5 feet. So you could draw smaller rooms, but then use a 10-foot grid square instead of a 5-foot grid square. I guess it's not really an abstract map at that point, but it still lets you build a bigger area. So why do you want to use an abstract map? Why would you bother with this? Why not just use a gridded map? So there's a few reasons that I'll give you that I think make it very advantageous. I'm going to start with, so it's speed. It is very, very fast to whip these out. You don't have to worry about the grid. You don't have to worry about a lot of details. You can just very quickly draw the situation. A few lines on the map, a few areas, big circles that can show you things, little X's and O's for where the characters are versus where the monsters are. It's very, very quick to build an abstract map and not have to spend a lot of time. It can be very, very fast. So from that standpoint, is extremely flexible and extremely quick to draw out an abstract map and just give your players a visual of what's going on without going through all the nitty-gritty detail of using a detailed battle map of some sort. Another big one is cost. One of the neat things about an abstract battle map is like much of the pricing of tabletop role-playing games in general starts at 0 and there's no upper limit. And the example is you could start with just a piece of paper and a pencil you stole from the local dog track and just draw out stuff. You probably can find pieces of paper in people's recycling bins, so you don't even need to go get a sheet of paper if you don't have one. And you can take like an old pencil that you find somewhere, go to a library. Libraries are happy to give you a little pencil. You grab a little pencil and you draw out your map. It can be totally free to make abstract battle maps for nothing at all, with just a piece of paper and a pencil. But if you want to throw a budget at it, you can go pretty high. You can get your dry erase battle maps. You can get some other kind of little terrain pieces that you want to use. You can go far out to the Dwarven Forge side. Because I like Dwarven Forge as a hobby as well, I have a significant Dwarven Forge repository. I also have a lot of miniatures. I still use an abstract map. I still say things like, don't worry too much about the distances here. Just tell me what you want to do. We'll get the character there. Or I'll say like, this is nearby, this is far, or it's going to take you a move and a dash to get up here. There's lots of different ways to deal with that. Dwarven Forge stuff works really well as an abstract map because it looks very visual and very cool, but you don't necessarily have to count out every single square in order to figure things out. 3, and this is a real big one for me, is it keeps you focused on the cinematic action of the game. That in my opinion, when we're focused on a 5-foot gridded map, we're too into the weeds. I know, I'm making an opinion about this, and if you love your 5-foot gridded map and you disagree with me, I'm totally on board. You get to decide how you want to enjoy D&D. I know how I enjoy my game, and I know that for me, when I switch to an abstract map, the focus on the action, the focus on the cinematic action going on the game increased. I noticed this when I was playing Fate. I noticed this when I was playing 13th Age. I noticed this when I'm playing Shadowdark, that when I'm playing these games, there's less of a worry about distance and specific little measures and more of a focus on the things you're doing, blasting people with a burning hands and throwing a fireball across the room and running across the room and hacking at guys with a sword along the way. If you think about the action movies that we often base our games on, the scenes that we want to encapsulate, those scenes are not usually worried about 5-foot distances. Oh, I got almost close and then I couldn't. Sometimes there's little bits of tactical stuff that are going on there, but a lot of times it's the cinematic action that really makes this exciting. So that to me is maybe one of the biggest reasons that we want to use an abstract battle map, is hanging on to the cinematic action of the game and still having a visual representation so that people can orient themselves around what's going on. I completely recognize that if you're running pure theater of the mind all the time, that you're going to have some players who are just disengaged from the game. They just don't understand what's going on. But one nice thing is all it takes is a little bit of a diagram to show them what's going on and give them an idea what's happening. And then they're back and engaged with the game again. So that's why I think that like abstract maps are a really good position in between theater of the mind combat, which is completely narrative and completely cinematic, and detailed gridded combat. So I think it is highly underused. I would recommend trying it out. Sometimes you can, and if you want to figure it out and you want to try it out, but you're like, yeah, but I do 5-foot gridded battle maps all the time and I want to do that. One of the ways, just do it for a couple of battles. Do it for some of your smaller battles. Do it for battles where you know the players have an upper hand and it's not a big deal what the positioning is like. I recommend this for theater of the mind as well, that if you want to run some kind of narrative battles where you don't have any visualizations at all, or your visualizations are very loose like an abstract map, do it for some of the battles that are not quite as super conditional as a big set piece battle with lots of different monsters on it. One of the things that I think that happens when we run all of our games on a grid is that every battle becomes significant, because it takes a fair bit of work in order to build those. So we don't run encounters that are easy. And we should be running, I think GMs should be running more encounters that are easy. I think players like to have encounters where they have the upper hand. I think that it's really fun to run encounters where you don't necessarily know if it's going to turn into combat or not. And that's a good time when you can use an abstract map or theater of the mind combat, is when you weren't sure if it was going to be a battle, but it became one. I think that by having the flexibility to create abstract battle maps very quickly while we're running our game makes it easier for us to improvise the game that we're running. And that's really key to the flexibility of making sure that the game is going in the direction that it goes, regardless of what we brought to the table or not. Being able to improvise is super, super important in the game. And you can't improvise if all of your battles are set piece, 5-foot gridded, super detailed battle maps. Then you're driving towards those battle maps. You're going to build your encounters. And trust me, I know, because I did it. I did it for decades. From 3rd edition to 4th edition, I focused on gridded play, because both of those editions focused on gridded play. And I know, I'm not saying those games were bad. My players had fun. I had fun. We know that people really love them. Matt Colville and the MCDM RPG is really focused on the idea of super tactical fights, right? They like that style of play because they're not bad. I can tell you though, having played that way for a long time, games where it's like you have, I've got a session. How long is it? 4 hours? Okay, that's about 3 battles that I can run in that 4-hour period. So I'm going to have battle 1, battle 2, battle 3, and then I'm going to have some stuff that's going to take it from one battle to the next. Trust me, they fought every one of those battles because I wasn't about to set up a set piece that they could just walk their way or talk their way out of. Now I am a much more flexible GM. I bring tools to the table that let me build maps quickly, let me set up encounters depending on what we need at the time, random encounters that occur, all different kinds of things that I do. And the abstract battle map is a really good improvisational tool to help me be able to do that. So try out the abstract map, use it for some of your more inconsequential fights, use it as a tool to help you improvise, and put it in your toolbox along with all of the others. You don't have to give up one in order to do the other. You can have big set piece, super detailed gridded battle maps. You can also run some battles in Theater of the Mind, and you can run some with an abstract map. You get to decide which one of those tools best fits the situation that's occurring at the table and use that tool in order to tell the stories that you're telling. Every month on the Sly Flourish Patreon, we have a Patreon Q&A, monthly Patreon Q&A. Patrons can ask any question that they want to ask about tabletop role-playing games. Every Friday, I go through all of the questions on the Patreon Q&A. Some of them make it to the show here. Other ones become catalysts for their own articles or videos that I publish elsewhere. Ben H. says, "Hey, Mike, so in my City of Arches campaign, yay, is having to end abruptly due to my wife and I moving states. This is leaving me with 2 sessions to wrap up the campaign to a satisfying state. The Dread Necropolis was recently risen, and it felt like the beginning of a new arc, so I'm unsure how to make it a satisfying ending. How would you recommend, or do you have any tips for a campaign being cut short abruptly?" It's a good one. That happens. Real life happens. Sometimes campaigns have to end quickly. I always recommend, how do you start at the end, right? How do you say, what do I want the final battle of this thing to be, the final conclusion of this thing to be? And it doesn't necessarily need to be collapsing the Dread Necropolis. It could be one big quest and one big ending to that quest, recognizing that the Dread Necropolis is still up. What's the Dread Necropolis? In the City of Arches campaign, which is my current big Patreon product and upcoming Kickstarter, city-based, a city, high fantasy city campaign source book for lazy DMs. I'm trying to work on that tagline, right? A high fantasy city source book for lazy DMs. I think that's pretty good. There's a campaign arc in which evildoers rise up a big, terrible temple that comes popping out of the desert and then lays siege to the City of Arches from this terrible place called the Dread Necropolis. You don't necessarily have to defeat the Dread Necropolis, but you could decide hey, I'm going to narrow it down. But I think when you only have a couple of sessions left, start with the ending and work your way backwards. Start with what you want the final thing to be. Figure out how you're going to get there, and be prepared to cut about half of what you do in order to make sure it actually gets there. This is also true for when you're running a one-shot game. When you're running a single session game, you want to say what do I want my conclusion to be? And how do I make sure that I have a path to get the characters to that conclusion? And how do I recognize what I can throw away in the middle in order to meet time? And I think you can do that when you have only a couple of ones. For like the Dread Necropolis, what you could say is like, and I'm making this up because I made up the Dread Necropolis, so I get to make up everything else about it too. There's like an evil sphere in the center, like an artifact that is actually the heart of the Dread Necropolis. And if you were to manage to destroy that sphere, the whole necropolis would collapse down and be destroyed as well, regardless of like having to defeat all of the bad guys. So maybe the characters can kind of break their way in, trying to find their way into the Dread Necropolis, get to the area of the sphere, shatter the sphere, and collapse the thing. It could be fun because you might even have like some kind of sacrifice has to be made. Or maybe they have to find an archway that's inside the Dread Necropolis and the key to use the archway in order to escape so they're not all killed after destroying the sphere. But you want to like, what is the end? The end is destroying the sphere. So then how do you get there? And you say like, okay, we're going to have a situation. And you might say like, well, the Dread Necropolis was run by a Death Knight. So that's okay, but the characters aren't anywhere close to being able to fight a Death Knight. Well, that's fine. They don't have to necessarily face the Death Knight. It could be like Darth Vader. You just don't want him to be around and, oh my God, here he's coming. We got to get out of here before he comes or we're going to get butchered. So you could have a situation of like the Death Knight that is running the Dread Necropolis is the failure state. If you face him, you're done. But you want the players to know and the characters to know that there is a Death Knight walking around somewhere and you need to like distract him or you need to somehow get him away from the place or make sure he doesn't know you're there. And so, but what I would do in generally is I would try to narrow that arc down significantly to just what the conclusion is, build the story backwards from that conclusion, and then know what you can throw away if time starts to get tighter, if you know you're not going to necessarily make it. If you have a couple of sessions, that can help you because by the time you're in between the two sessions, you know how much you're going to have to cut from the next one in order to get that final conclusion. So Ben, I hope that helps. Unfirth says, as far as I can tell, your secrets and clues are always true. Do you ever give out false information as a distraction or a false lead? Generally, I don't. And the reason why is that it's hard enough to get players to hang on to secrets and clues that are true. If I start to throw them that are false, they might never pick up on anything that actually matters. So when I'm writing my secrets and clues down, I'm writing down truths. It doesn't necessarily mean that the characters won't pick up false information. But I'll tell you, a lot of times they'll come up with their own false information. You don't need to come up with rumors. They will just go down the wrong path on their own. So you generally don't have to come up with false leads. Unless your characters are super like detail oriented and they're sitting there with the notebooks, writing everything down, they're figuring out all the paths, they know all the stuff, and you really feel like it could be interesting to throw some false leads in there. But generally speaking, I don't. Generally speaking, the secrets and clues are always true. And the characters are, just for them to grasp the main story that's going on is hard enough. And I don't really need to do more than that. So my answer is, yeah, do I give out false information? Sometimes. But usually the secrets and clues that I'm trying to reveal are almost always true. Blake says, when my characters walk into dungeons or places with lots of monsters, oftentimes the gameplay can get laborious. It starts to feel like roll initiative, kill the monsters. Oh, there's another monster in this room. Roll initiative, kill the monster, rinse and repeat. I have tried to solve this by having the monsters all come in throughout combat, but that ends up sacrificing the story and taking autonomy from the players because maybe they won't ever go into a room that the monster is in. How do you solve this issue? This is a really good example of where we need to be paying attention to pacing and beats in our game. Dungeons, the way you're talking about them, are almost all downward beats. They're fighting monsters. The monsters are really hard. They manage to scrape by. They fight another set of monsters. The monsters are really hard. They barely scrape by and so on. And a lot of GMs grab onto this. They say, well, like, that's how it should be. Like, we build balanced combats and we're worried about combat attrition and we want to make sure that they're using their resources before they get to the final fight. There's lots of arguments I've heard GMs make that lead them to the direction of running boring dungeons where all you ever do is fight one battle over another that are all roughly equivalent to the power level of the character so that the characters have to use up their spells. And that when they get to a boss fight, they don't sit there and nuke the boss with all the spells that they've been keeping up. This is where it's really important for you to think about your upward beats that you're going to run in a dungeon. Dungeons in particular need upward beats. I have an article over on Sly Flourish. Let's go find it. I have an article on Sly Flourish called The Beats of a Dungeon Crawl. I wrote this, 5 years ago at this point, and it's pretty amazing because it feels like it was like yesterday. And it talks about what are some of the hopeful dungeon beats that you can put in there. We all know that there's monsters in there. We know it's dark. We know it's dangerous. We know there are traps. We know all the typical stuff of dungeons. So that means that we as GMs have to work hard to come up with the other parts of it. What are some of the good things that can happen in dungeons? So I have a D20 list here, but you can use these as inspiration, and it's probably worth doing during your prep to make a list. What are some of the things that could occur in this dungeon that are positive, that are upward beats, that give characters an advantage over things? So here are a quick list of 20. A healing font that restores the character's characters to full health, a lost magic weapon, a friendly ghost who gives useful information, a torn tapestry revealing a useful secret or clue, a trap that can be used against the enemies, a hidden treasure vault, a secret passage that bypasses a hazard, a hidden room offering safety for a short or long rest, a map revealing a piece of the whole of the dungeon, an amulet that lets the characters bypass a trap, hazard, or group of monsters, a useful ambush point, a friendly or turncoat monster, a statue that casts a 1-hour bless on the characters, a snoozing guard, a corpse possessing a powerful single-use relic, a group of skeletons easily turned by the cleric, a group of low-powered monsters easily blasted by the wizard's fireball, a hazard that can be turned against a group of enemies, high ground that offers an advantageous position, a powerful monster convinced to become an ally. So those are just 20 possible options, and these are intended to inspire you. You could use this list of your own, right? It's here, it's on the article, or you can come up with your own. And I would recommend coming up with your own because then you can tailor them around the dungeon, you can tailor them around the situation. Think about one thing you'll notice from this is previous to my idea of lightning rods. Lightning rods are monsters that are specifically put in place to show off cool character capabilities. That idea of wow, a group of angry cannibal orcs are running towards you all in a 40-foot diameter circle. And you're like, do you want to fireball them? And they're like, yes, I would. They explode. They all have less than 12 hit points. And your fireball, they all blow up. Go ahead and put situations in there where characters get to use their stuff and really look cool. Throw tons of undead against your clerics who are able to cast Destroy Undead and blast them away. Have lots of monsters group up together so that you can blast them with stuff. Do all that kind of thing. So those are examples of battle things. But then in dungeons, there's lots of secret rooms, secret passageways, walls that collapse into a holy fountain that gives people the equivalent of a short rest for drinking it. Lots of different ways that you want to throw upward beats in your dungeon. And that's really, I think, reading your message, that's what sounds like is needed, is there are opportunities for the characters to make discoveries that are directly beneficial to them is a major way to add upward beats into your typical dungeon crawls. Chaz says, you've mentioned several adventures having potential TPK adventures at level 1. If you're selecting 2 from 3 quests at level 1 and you would ostensibly do number 2 at level 2, what should publishers do to ensure they're challenging at both levels? My obvious one is to stick to, if they're level 2, add X or Y monsters here, here, and here, or not let them go to level 2 before 2 quests are concluded. But there may be a more elegant solution. I don't know if it's elegant, but my solution is you have one adventure that they do at first level that gets them to second level. You don't bother. If you want to make 3 possible paths, especially if you're custom building your own campaign, you might offer 3 options for first level adventures. But I think a big one that all designers, I believe pretty firmly about this, that there is a fundamental breakdown in how we describe the tiers of 5th edition. That we often talk about 5th edition as being 4 tiers. Tier 1, which is 1st to 4th level. Tier 2, which is 5th to 10th level. Tier 3, which is 11 to 16th level. And Tier 4, which is 17 to 20th level. I think there's actually 5 tiers. And I think you could say a tier 0, but that doesn't make any sense because it's level 1. Tier 1 is first level. First level is its own tier. 2nd to 4th level is tier 2. Or so on. You could have tier 0 if you want to keep the same 4 tiers. But have a tier 0. And a tier 0 is first level. Because first level adventures should be fundamentally different than 2nd through 20th level. If you think about the power gain that characters get from 1st to 2nd level, it's bigger than any other power gain they will get at any other level in 5th edition. They get 40% more hit points when they go from 1st to 2nd level. They get a huge amount of extra resources. Many times they get subclasses and stuff like that. Or they get new class features and things like that. Build your adventures for first level characters. When you have first level characters, build adventures specifically for those first level characters. If you're designing adventures, and this is something that I do when I'm doing it, there's almost always a first level adventure that gets them to 2nd level that is unique to that level, not set. So instead of trying to do a bunch of different adventures that could be played from 1st to 4th level, I do just first level adventures and then 2nd to 4th level. And trust me, it's a lot easier to design adventures that way and make sure that you're not going to just have first level characters get wiped out by stupid stuff. Edmund says, how do you feel about disarming or altering characters' long-held loot for a particular scenario, i.e. putting a lock up your weapons and spellcasting focuses for this high-stakes wedding you're all going to? Should it be a surprise or telegraphed? Is it challenging in a fun way or needlessly punitive? it's needlessly punitive. Don't take away characters' options. It's just, nobody likes it, right? Like, this is one of those things where it seems like a good idea. There's lots of stuff in this RPG hobby of ours, and the adventures that we run and the campaigns we run, and particularly in high fantasy RPG kind of stuff. Lots of things that seem like a good idea, and they really suck. And one of them, I'll give you a couple of examples. This is a big one. Somehow the players or characters are limited in their capabilities for this particular scenario. My wife's least favorite adventure, she still talks about back when we were playing 4th edition. And she had a 4th edition game that was like a tier 2 or tier 3 game where the characters are pretty meaty. And there was some arbitrary reason why they couldn't use any of their encounter or daily abilities, and their magic items didn't work. So they were stuck with at-will abilities that were underpowered for their level for the whole adventure. And she just goes on about how terrible, like, it sucked. She's like, yeah, we succeeded, and yeah, we did some stuff, but it sucked because I had all these capabilities. So when you take characters and you put them in a situation where they lose capabilities, it's no fun. You're taking their agency away. There's almost no sin worse than taking agency away from the characters and therefore taking away from players. Another really good example that's kind of mixed up with this is the force capture. The time when you force a situation so that the characters are captured just because that's what the story needs. That sucks. You know, if the characters get captured because of circumstances, if they make actions or they lose a battle or something happens and they end up being captured, that's not quite so bad. And even then, if you take their gear away, it's not quite so bad because they know what led them there. They know they had a bad battle. They know things went wrong. If you're designing the battle to make them lose so that they'll be captured, shame on you, right? If they get captured, that's fine. So the one situation that I think often comes up when I bring this up is Out of the Abyss. People bring up the adventure Out of the Abyss and say, oh, that must mean that's terrible. I actually don't think Out of the Abyss is terrible because you start. That's the beginning of the scenario, is you're already captured. You didn't lose anything. You never had it. So I think that if you're starting a scenario where the characters are captured and they don't have any gear and they're just trying to survive, I think that's okay. I'd probably check with my players to make sure that's what they want to do. But I wouldn't have a situation where they lose stuff because, boy, loss aversion is a really big downward beat. There might not be any downward beats more negative than that. If it happens through circumstances, that's one thing. But if you're forcing the issue, that's something else. So I don't think designing scenarios where the players are limited with the stuff they have is a good scenario. I think you're just going to have angry players. Is there a way to do it right? Probably. Is there a way to convince your players that they can still have fun? Maybe. Is it worth the extra effort to do so? Probably not. Just make adventures that give characters the abilities that they want to take. That's my feeling on that. Mr. Smith says, I think it's great that titles from MCDM and Kobold Press are now being offered on D&D Beyond, but I've had the book and PDFs for a while now, and I don't really want to buy them again. What are other DMs doing if we want to offer this content to our players within D&D Beyond? Just continue to homebrew everything that we use? Appreciate you taking the question. I could talk a lot about the third-party products, quote-unquote third-party products that are available on D&D Beyond and what that means, and does it mean that we're kind of getting too hooked into D&D Beyond and that D&D Beyond is becoming the monopoly that Wizards was going for when they tried to revoke the OGL in the first place? I don't think that's necessarily not true. But also, it's like just a tool, and you have your PDFs, and these books they're not exclusive to D&D Beyond, so that's okay. And you can get these books on lots of different platforms. I talked on my last show that I think it's okay to have to buy a product a second time when the way you're interacting with that product is very different than the way you were interacting it when you bought it the first time. An example is if you buy a physical adventure book for D&D that you would sit and read or use at your table, but then you also have a version on D&D Beyond that includes digital maps and tokens and monsters that you can throw in the encounter builder and character options that the characters can choose from. That's a different way of interacting with that product. So I don't feel like it's bad for Wizards to make you buy it again or sell it to you at a discount or whatever that they're doing now, because I feel like it's a different kind of product. I don't think you should necessarily have the expectation that if you buy a product in any format, you should have it available to you in every other format, because many of those formats have totally different ways that you interact with them. And it takes a lot of effort to make them available to that form that interacts. So I don't mind that. I will say, I especially think for like Kobold Press and MCDM, and the other publishers that are publishing there on D&D Beyond is there's not really a lot of stuff there that you would share with your other players. So I don't necessarily think that you would need to buy the stuff there if you already bought it to share it with your players. Also, and I'll have a link to this in the show notes, there are ways that you can share your PDFs with your players that's legal and that's going to ensure that they don't just copy it and then send it off to wherever they're going to get it. You can give them the ability to view a PDF through something like Google Drive, selecting the idea that they cannot print it and they cannot download it from the view. That's an article I have up on Sly Flourish. I'll link to it. So that's a way that you can share material when you need to share material with them as well. One of the things that occurs to me the more I think about D&D Beyond and what it's doing and how it's growing and how new products are getting put up there is that the only really killer function of D&D Beyond that makes it risky as a monopoly or that really drives people to use it is the character builder. Yes, you can build encounters with it. I was actually on their podcast, on the D&D Beyond show, talking about the encounter builder and what you could do with it. Yeah, they have a new virtual tabletop with maps. But, and yeah, you have sort of a mobile-friendly version of a book that you bought. And that's all pretty good, right? But that's not really a killer app. Like, you can go ahead and search your PDFs just as easily as you can search on the material you bought on D&D Beyond. And there's lots of different ways to use virtual tabletops to do things. There's, lots of different tools that let you look up monster stats. I have the artisanal monster database, which I was able to put together for patrons of Sly Flourish. So I think a lot of the functionality that exists in D&D Beyond is stuff you can really get elsewhere pretty easily, except the character builder. And there, to my mind, the only other one that I know of is Shard for having a good, decent, mobile-friendly character builder for 5th edition that lets you print a character sheet. I know that Demiplane is working on one for 5th edition, but it seems to keep getting pushed back, which is kind of a shame. And there's a few other character builders, and there are people who are definitely fine with your printable PDFs and stuff like that. But to me, the real function of D&D Beyond that makes it as popular as it is, that makes it as hard to replicate as it is the character builder. I think everything else that's outside of the character builder doesn't really matter that much, because I think it's just as easy for us to navigate PDFs or even physical books or other things as it is to kind of look stuff up on D&D Beyond. Is it a convenience? Sure. Is it a convenience worth buying something twice? Probably not. I think the only time I'd really buy something twice on D&D Beyond, a second time on D&D Beyond, is if it was integrated with the character builder, and that was something that I really wanted players to have access to through the character builder. So the more I think about it, the more I think that the killer app that makes D&D Beyond as sticky as it is, the thing that drives people to really use it, is that it is by far the best character builder for D&D 5th edition. Shard is second, but I think, I like Shard, and I like that it's got access to it, and I tried it out. I don't think it's quite as strong as what the D&D character builder has, which makes sense because it's like Wizards spent $130 million to buy it. Like, I was talking to Morris about this on the EN World podcast, that like, hey, anybody else got $130 million lying around to make a really good character builder? I don't think so. So that, I think, is a really good question. So that's a long way of getting to your question. I would say, like, look, if you already have a copy, I would just stick with the copy you have and find other ways to share it with your group. I don't think you need to buy it again on D&D Beyond. And really, the only stuff on D&D Beyond that I think is more likely to be valuable to share with your players are character options they have access to. So there is that. Friends, I want to thank all of you for hanging out with me today while we talked about all things in tabletop role-playing games. I hope you enjoyed today's show. I always love doing this. Thank you all so much for coming. If you like this show and you want more stuff like this from me, the best thing you can do is subscribe to the Sly Flourish newsletter. There is a link in the show notes. It is absolutely free to sign up. You get a free adventure generator for signing up. You get an email sent directly to your inbox that has an article about tabletop role-playing games, plus links to all of the other stuff that I've done. You can support me directly on Patreon and get access to the awesome Lazy DM community over on Discord, help support the work that I do everywhere, and get awesome tools, tips, tricks, and supplements to help make your games awesome. And you can pick up my books like Return of the Lazy Dungeon Master, the Lazy DM's Workbook, Forge of Foes, Lazy DM's Companion, Fantastic Adventure Books, t-shirts, mugs, calendars, all kinds of things on the Sly Flourish bookstore. You can find a link to that in the show notes as well. Thank you all so much. Have a great day, and get out there and play an RPG.